Hi, everybody. I'm going to freeze the frame in just a little while, but I wanted to begin this lecture talking about murders in the Rue Morgue alive and kicking, since so much of the murders in the Rue Morgue involves, death and no kicking. First of all, I wanted to just say I post, as you probably will notice, I tend to post a general outline of what I'm going to be talking about. You'll notice that my conversational style tends to be sort of circular, so, I'll go forward and come back, and, don't worry about that. But these are just basically some of the things that I'm going to cover as I talk about, really, first of all, the story as the story in general, and then we're going to dig into the very first part of the story. I want to preface everything that I'm going to say by saying this is a really hard read. So if you're sitting there reading that thing, I want you to know that it's not just you. Or if you're sitting there going, "Oh, I'm never going to make it. It's only 20 pages, but it's the most painful 20 pages of my life." Don't worry about it, and we'll sort of swim our way through it. And I'm sure you'll do fine. Anyway, I'm going to freeze the camera now, if I can. Mouse, and we'll continue on talking about the story. Okay, now that I'm frozen, let's first of all do something that we're going to do throughout the semester, which is, first and foremost, we're going to be looking at detective fiction as a reflection of the cultural moment in which they are produced. And I know I use that phrase a lot, when I say cultural moment, I mean, what's going on in the culture that Poe comes from, the world that he lives in. What can we learn about the world that he lives in from looking at this story? And even in the very first part, we're learning a lot of things. First of all, this is something specific to our cultural moment. It's that we don't, he is writing about an alien world. And one of the reasons why it's valuable to read stories like this and things like Frankenstein or any of the novels from the 19th century is that you get a sense of how far things have altered and how many things stay more or less the same. We're looking at a genre that hasn't really had that much time to evolve, and we're going to see a lot of the same expectations and ideas, even though we'd be so surprised, still alive and well today. So I'm going to come back to talking about what's going on in this story in a moment, but I want to look at this incredibly chewy, as I called it in the announcement, this incredibly chewy introduction. And this is one thing that we're seeing when we're looking at this, when I'm talking about this as a reflection of the cultural moment. This story starts out with a quote. Now that in and of itself is an oho 19th century. In my own writing and in the writers of many people I read, quotes are very common. However, this little piece of quote from Sir Thomas Browne references Greek mythology and Greek and Roman mythology, and it talks about it calls upon something that was tremendously common knowledge. Young men received of any birth and standing or any kind of money, and sometimes even with no money, young men would receive what was called a classical education. And this really persisted up into the 1950s, even maybe the 1960s. To some extent, it still persists in England. But a classical education was where people learned Greek and they learned Latin and they read books in those languages and were expected to be relatively fluent in them. And they would also almost certainly do another foreign language. And this is in grammar school. They started studying this. So already we're seeing that something that Poe and his literary cohorts and his readers took for granted. Now, make no mistake about it. Although Poe is studied as a literary craftsman, when he produced things, he did it to, I mean, he wrote for magazines. He wrote, he wasn't somewhere going, oh, I really, my great art cannot be sullied by money. He definitely wrote for money, and he was an editor, and, he had a job and a 15-year-old wife, and, check out his biography. He's quite a fellow. But anyway, a very interesting writer. So we start out with this quote, and the quote, which I what song the sirens sang, or what name Achilles assumed when he bid himself among women, although puzzling questions are not beyond all conjecture. And again, these are two different mentions from classical mythology, but what Thomas Browne is saying is, even though we don't know for sure, we can figure it out. We can guess. We can arrive at some kind of a reasonable answer. And therein lies the key to Murders in the Rue Morgue. And therein also lies the key to this unbelievably boring and hard to get through. And this is me. Maybe you love Poe, and forgive me if I'm defaming him, but this difficult beginning. Now, let's talk about the beginning in general. Okay? This is a very, as I think I mentioned in the announcement, this is a very common tactic for 19th century writers, actually 18th and 19th century writers. What you see them doing is, before we get to the story, we have to kind of set it up. What are we looking at? What's going on here? Because there was a very strong sense that the purpose of literature wasn't just to entertain, it was to educate, it was to inspire thought. And what's so fascinating is, here is Poe, who really is he's an outstanding storyteller, and who really writes for people's entertainment, to give them the willies, and to compel fear in them, and all this kind of stuff. But it's ironic that he also really feels that compulsion, that desire that he has to kind of justify. I'm going to tell you this one story, but at the same time, I'm also going to educate you. I'm going to theorize. Now, what he does, and I'm going to read, what I'd like to do is read some of this, but generally, if you want to put it in a nutshell, what Poe is saying in this introduction, he's saying, analytical person enjoys that activity. And analysis is, it's somebody who performs analysis on a high level, wants to do it all the time. And for the rest of us poor rubes who aren't particularly analytical, when they produce, they come up with some solution, we're all amazed. Oh my goodness, are you psychic? Did the fairies tell you? That kind of stuff. So it's sort of in a nutshell. And then he goes on talking about different kinds of games. You could probably guess he's not very fond of chess, if you read this closely. But he talks about drafts, which is actually checkers. And then he talks about a very complicated card game, which it's kind of like, it's analogous to whist. I'm sorry, it's analogous to bridge. Not the same kind of rules, but the same kind of complexity. He talks about this card game called whist. But let's take a look at what he's saying, because there's actually a lot in here, hard though it may be to get to at first. I'm going to read, I'm going to go paragraph by paragraph in this first part for us, okay? The mental features discoursed of as the analytical are in themselves but little susceptible of analysis. In other words, it's hard to analyze analysis, the act of analyzing. It's hard to do that. Okay. We appreciate them only in their effects. We know of them, among other things, that they are always to their possessor, when inordinately possessed, a source of liveliest enjoyment. As the strong man exults in his physical ability, delighting in such exercises as call his muscles into action, so glories the analyst in that moral activity which disentangles. Okay, I'm going to stop there for just a moment. When we go back to we only appreciate them in their effects. It means that we're really, the most that we know, the place where we can really look at analysis is when somebody performs one of these mental feats, and kind of what he calls disentangling. Somebody can take this snarl of ideas and can pull them all apart and make sense of them. And I think here we're seeing something that is absolutely key as we start looking at the first detective. It's this idea that the detective relies on highly evolved skills of disentangling, of logic. You already see a setup here where of the kind of person a detective would be, at least in this first initial thing. It's somebody for whom emotion is not key, and what we see a little bit later is that observation is, and then the processing of data, the compiling and analysis of data is part and parcel of what a detective does. But let's go back to this. I mean, he then makes this analogy where he says, they have so much fun analyzing that it's just like, working out. Somebody who's all buff and wants to work out, and this is what they do. And then he says that because this is such a pleasure, he likes to do it all the time. He does everything, just anything that will let him do it. He likes enigmas and conundrums. He likes, puzzles, basically. Things that are confusing to most people, he excite him. And then it says, exhibiting in his solutions of each degree of acumen, a degree of acumen which appears to the ordinary apprehension rather natural. In other words, this is what I was saying before, when he does this, the solutions that he comes up with seem supernatural or beyond the natural to us poor slobs who weren't able to come up with the answer. You'll really see this when who's the detective in this story, along with our narrator, and comes up with this. He basically, quote unquote, reads his mind through observation, and the narrator's like, "Oh my God, you're so smart! How did you do that?" It's Dupin does the Edgar Allan Poe version of Sherlock Holmes's, it's elementary, my dear Watson, which means, duh, if you weren't such a blockhead, you could have figured it out. Anyway, but it says his results brought about by the very soul and essence of method have in truth the whole air of intuition. And here we come to another piece of what I was talking about before, that with a detective, what we see is that just stitches together this fabric of observation and analysis, and we cannot believe that this person was able to do this through logic, and to us it seems miraculous or intuitive. Guessed, basically. He had a lucky guess. Now, he goes on, and I'm just going to kind of paraphrase here. I'm scrolling down, and please feel free to do that. But talks about the faculty of resolution, and I like resolution, putting things back together so that they were solved. It's the sense of things being broken apart by, mystery or a puzzle is where things are apart and need to be reassembled. So the ability to do this, according to him, might be strengthened by studying higher math analysis, which is called analysis. But it's not, you can't think of analysis just as calculation. And here we come to the beginning of a second key in the in what a detective traditionally does, which is they don't just calculate. They don't just kind of add up all the pieces. But they do more with that. They put them together in creative ways, in inspired ways. And so there is that element, even though it's founded on logic and action, there is that element of superior ability to see in what everybody else looks at and is completely confounded, to be able to make those pieces come together. And one of the things we're going to see, is that this archetype, this kind of model of what a detective looks like, is that as the detective story evolves, authors start playing with this convention, because here we are, we're seeing the first narrative conventions of the detective story. This is what the detective does. He's an analyst. He's this creative kind of mind and person apart, and he's somehow, I don't want to say superhuman, but has some incredible gift and talent which mark him, or later her, as different. But in this case, but what we're going to see as we, get a few stories in, is that as the world becomes more uncertain and things start, writers start deconstructing that and start giving us detectives who are flawed in their reasoning, or who are, who make mistakes, who have things happen to them that because they weren't quite smart enough, who are led astray. Okay. Now, I just, if we look down a little bit farther, he says this whole thing about chess, and what he's saying, chess is just frivolity. It's just people are, he doesn't like it, and he doesn't think the problem is that, what people need to do is they need to, in order to be able to solve a problem, you need to have something, you need to have a game, here's another thing, that it has to be the right kind of game. And that's where he starts to talking about drafts, and then he talks about, at length about whist, okay? And I'm going to take us down a little bit and have us look at this. Let's have a look at what he's saying about whist. Whist has long been known for its influence upon what is termed the calculating power, and men of the highest order of intellect have been known to take an apparently unaccountable delight in it, while eschewing chess as frivolous. Tell that to Bobby Fischer. Beyond doubt, there is nothing of a similar nature so greatly tasking the faculty of analysis. The best chess player in Christendom may be little more than the best player of chess, but proficiency in whist implies a capacity for success in all these more important undertakings where mind struggles with mind. Now, if you look at this encapsulates what he's saying. He's saying chess has all these rules, and so you're focused on the rules and the moves and your opponent's moves, but not on anything really. You're in your own head. You're not. You don't go out into the outside world. Then he goes on to talk about, well, what does somebody do if they're playing whist well? What does a good player do? And I'm moving on to, I'm on just before page 3. It says he makes in silence a host of observations and inferences. So perhaps to his companions, and the difference in the extent of the information obtained lies not so much in the validity of the inference as in the quality of the observation. So it's not just that what the analyst sees is true, it's what he, and I keep using the word he because that's what Poe is doing, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. It's because it's not just that he observes it, but what he does with that observation. And this is when we, as you get into the story, and Dupin not only notices that the narrator is staring down at the street, but also notices how he's staring at it, and draws conclusions based on how he's doing it. And I'm going to pick up here again. Our player confines himself not at all, nor because the game is the object does he reflect deductions from things external to the game. He examines the countenance of his partners, comparing it carefully with each of his opponents. He considers the mode of assorting the cards in each hand, often counting trump by trump and honor by honor through the glances bestowed by their holders upon each. He notes every variation of face as the play progresses, gathering a fund of thought from the differences in the expression of certainty, of surprise, of triumph, or chagrin. Now, any of you who have ever watched poker on ESPN, you're familiar with this. You see, and this is why a lot of those players wear sunglasses. But all the body. So what he's saying is, Poe is saying A real detective, a real analyst, observes holistically, and they're alive to everything that's going on. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us at the point where we have a picture of the kind of analysis that Poe thinks is best, and it is something that isn't just it's not something that's simple. It's a combination of factors. When he makes this interesting quote here where he says, the analytical power, and I'm now on page 3, the analytical power should not be confounded with simple ingenuity. For while the analyst is necessarily ingenious, the ingenious man is often remarkably incapable of analysis. So, and this is kind of, it's one of those things where he's splitting hairs, but the point is that what I was saying earlier, a true analyst, and we'll just switch over and use the word detective. A true detective puts the results of his observations and then his analysis together in an ingenious way. You know, he's inventive, he's creative. Again, we're coming back to that. But somebody who's inventive, there's no reason to suppose that they're also going to be sitting there being really analytical. In fact, they may be quite the opposite because they're so busy being, you know, ingenious and inventive. The constructive or combining power by which ingenuity is usually manifested, and to which the phrenologists were people who tried to determine, who said that if they felt your head and measured your head, they could tell how smart you were, what kind of person you were going to be. Fascinating and completely racist and scary science of the 19th century, but really interesting to read about. But anyway, okay. So he said the phrenologists, I believe, erroneously, so this isn't true, have assigned a separate organ, supposing it a primitive faculty, which has been so frequently seen in those whose intellect bordered otherwise upon idiocy, as to have attracted general observation among writers of morals. Between ingenuity and the analytic ability, there exists a difference far greater, indeed, than that between the fancy and the imagination. So, fancy is and I just want to say he's making this comparison between analysis and ingenuity, because, and I'll go on and talk about what that comparison is in just a second, but the reason he's doing this is he's arguing that which makes a good detective is on a much higher order than simply being able to do mental conjuring tricks. He's saying it's much more than that. But the comparison that he's making is he's saying analysis is greater than ingenuity, just as fancy is greater than the imagination. What fancy means is, you know, just like a little whim, or you're sitting there, it's like a daydream, or you just kind of, you know, oh, I rather fancy her, you know, you just know, kind of. It's fancy. It's this kind of generally light and without real connection. Imagination is, particularly in the era that Poe's writing in, is something that is seen as incredibly powerful. The builder of stories and the builder of histories, and of the place where dreams and the souls and the passions live. That's imagination. Fancy is like doo, 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 doo. And imagination is like bum 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 bum. That's my analogy. Okay. So then he finally, after grinding us through all of this, and we had to play checkers, and we had to play whist, and we had to not play chess, and oh my God, but finally we're here. Okay. It will be found, in fact, that the ingenious are always fanciful, and the truly imaginative never otherwise than analytic. Well, I don't know about that. It sounds like quite a generalization, but Poe is basically, he wants to set us up, and then he says, all right, you've suffered enough, here's your story. Now, I want to say a couple of things about the story itself, just about the beginning of the story. First one was something I alluded to, and I said, I'll come back to this. Note that as Poe is talking about what men do, or what his analyst, which turns out to be his detective, Auguste Dupin. Forgive me for those of you who actually speak French. I probably murdered the poor guy's name, but that's as good I could do, as well as I could do. Notice that he uses the word he. Now, yes, even when I was a wee lassie, it was a convention to say he, whether you meant men and women or just men. But much more importantly, it was an absolutely foundational belief at this time that it was men who were analytical. Women were emotional, and they were, their role was to be sweet and good and kind and to ennoble men who are, although analytical, quite bestial. No, I don't believe that. I'm just saying that this was kind of the standard understanding of the difference between men and women. Okay, I'm here to tell you, kids, if you don't think that if you don't think that dichotomy between men and women, that story being told, that if you don't think that's still around, I got news for you. It really still is. It's very, very prevalent, and we'll have a great opportunity to look at that, and also to look at how detective fiction has come to terms with the changing roles of women. But right now we're back in the 18th century. I'm sorry, back in the 19th century. I want to talk about a couple of things. The other thing that I want to tell you up front with this story is please, if you don't understand a word, no shame to you, go look it up. Take Wikipedia with a grain of salt, because anybody can write it, and sometimes it's great and sometimes it's not. But you can find out so much, not just about what does this word mean, but as a gateway into culture. Some of this is will be difficult to understand unless you do that. I'll try and explain some of those things, though. Now, you'll notice in my little lecture outline, I say, what's going on with these two guys in the creepy house who are creatures of the night? So the setup for this story is that our narrator, while he's in Paris, happens upon this kind of nutty guy, and who also is who likes to buy books, and he's what Dupin is a product of a formerly wealthy and aristocratic family which has fallen upon hard times. He just has enough money to make it get by, but he's not really able to, he can't do more than that. He doesn't have any luxury in his life. Well, so he and our narrator meet, and then they end up shacking up in a creepy house in a weird neighborhood that's mostly deserted, and during the day, they pull all the shades, and they it sounds like that, maybe they sleep, but they pull the shades and they light the candles, and this is just like straight out of a gothic or horror novel. This bizarre thing. I mean, now one thing I want to say, there's a point, to some extent, the idea of single men living together, deciding to live together, and talking to one another. What the narrator says is, I felt my soul enkindled within me by the wild fervor and vivid freshness of his imagination. Seeking in Paris the objects I then sought, I felt that the society of such a man would be to me a treasure beyond price, and this feeling I frankly confided to him. Well, gee golly, I mean, to our modern ears, this sounds like he was in love with him, and he said, let's live together while I'm here in gay Paris, could we? I would say it's not. I wouldn't read it that way, because for a number of reasons. First of all, the language of 19th century literature is really still coming out of the Romantic era, where the expression of emotion between men and the portrayal of men expressing emotion to each other is really, really common. This isn't, this isn't something shocking, and this is not an overtly homosexual tale. So, I mean, you don't have to, we'll talk a lot more about the sexual tension that's in this story. But for now, I'm saying that it's a little less strange that these two men have decided to room together than it might seem now. However, the sitting in the dark and only going out at night, that's a little weird. So these two weird guys meet up, and because there is no internet, they can't sit around playing World of Warcraft. Sorry for those of you who play World of Warcraft. I'm sorry. I'm not a gamer, so I shouldn't even say anything. But these two guys decide that they're going to do it. They're going to live together and go out, and what they do is they talk. They go about, and they're looking at things, and they're talking about things, and the first thing that they start, or the first incidents where Dupin displays his analytical ability is just when they're walking in the street. And what he basically does is he, as I said earlier, quote unquote, reads our narrator's mind. And he does it in the way that any truly gifted and observant person would do, which is he's paying attention after the narrator stops paying attention. After the narrator gets distracted, Dupin keeps his mind and his eye and all of his other senses focused on what's going on around him. And then also he holds in mind the context, the things that they've been talking about in the past, the places that they're going by, the things in the news. All of these things are like a vivid tapestry that are alive for Dupin as he's walking along. So I'm going to leave you there because that's enough talking, and I don't want you to die of boredom. But that sort of gets us launched into the story. And I'll be there will be another lecture